All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this rainy Florida day. So I'm only 3 months in this wonderful new state as my new home state, so I'm still getting used to the weather, but now I see why it's able to be so lush and green, because we get a lot of rain. So anyway, I am Will Inboden, the relatively new director of the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education. We have a capacious academic mission of research and teaching on Western civilization, great books, American foundations, the history of our country, and doing all this in ways that we hope will train and equip our students for meaningful careers, whether in scholarship or in the private sector or in nonprofits or in public service and statecraft. And so that brings me to our topic and guest speaker for today. A little bit of somewhat unusual fare for a university to bring a CIA officer turned spy novelist, but I like to think that this is the culmination of Western civilization, right?
Oh man, that's bad news for all of us.
Spy novel. So anyway, so my friend David McCloskey. David had very distinguished and eclectic background. He grew up some in Minnesota and some down the highway in Orlando. So he's in some ways returning to his home state. He'll tell us a little more, but coming right out of college, joined the CIA and served there for about a decade, working primarily on the Middle East, and then did a number of years as a consultant with McKinsey, and then of late has become a spy novelist. And we are here to talk about his life and his career, but especially this marvelous new book, which I just finished the other day, Moscow X. So please join me in a warm University of Florida welcome to David McCloskey.
Thanks, Will. Right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So we got 3 parts to our program today. The first part is a enhanced interrogation. I will conduct it. Yeah, sorry, he gets on track too. Anyway, a friendly interrogation.
Do it with scotch.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Question, dialogue from me and David. Then we're going to turn it over to you for any questions you may have. And then afterwards, there's a chance to buy and get a signed copy of a book. So, and I'm told that any signed copies of his books can be sold for like 4 times retail value on eBay.
That's
so
right.
Anyway, there's next month's rent payment there. Also, they do make great Christmas presents. I just had him sign a copy for my dad. So. All right, David. So let's begin at the beginning. How did you first join the CIA? Was this something you had aspired to as a kid? How did this come about?
Yeah, and thanks again for having me. It's
Sure.
great to be here. So, no, I didn't aspire to it as a kid. I think I went to school at a small liberal arts college outside of Chicago called Wheaton College. Very small place. I wanted to be an international relations major, to my mom's horror, because she assumed I would never be employed after that, which turned out to be wrong, I'll say. But I kind of had a sense, I think, as a young person, that I wanted to understand how the world worked. I wanted to travel, and I was just really, books in the home. My dad was a university professor, so I'd been reading history widely and politics and spy novels, and just kind of wanted to see the world. And I didn't know what that would look like or where I'd do that. And then I think it was my sophomore year, the CIA actually showed up on campus to recruit. And at the time, my resume was like I had dug holes for a sprinkler system company, and I'd been a cashier at Wendy's. And so I was like, this seems like it could be a reasonable step up, Yeah. I like a lot of people who are relatively young at that time, like I threw my name in and figured, all right, I won't get the job, but I'll just try. The guy who had come to recruit on campus ran the Middle East analytic division at CIA, and he was an alum. And so I did some interviews with him, and lo and behold, a few months later, was going through the full process to do the polygraph and the psych exam and the medical exam and all that, and got an offer to join as an undergrad intern. And so it was really this pretty organic process of interest in the world and seeing CIA on campus and figuring like this would be a wonderful way to explore that. And so I did 2 summers as an intern. It's a very cool program, and I think it's still around. They bring you in, they fully clear you, and I was an analyst on a team.
Explain what fully clear means.
Yeah, so I mean you're not just brought into like some. You're given the lifestyle polygraph, the medical exam, the psych exam, like you were an employee of the CIA. So I had access to everything that people who had been there for 5 or 10 years working on. I was on the Syria team. Had access to everything they did, and I was, which kind of at the time even, I was like, this seems crazy. But I did, and I was a fully functioning member of the team. I actually wrote my first PDB article for then President Bush in the summer of 2006 as a 20-year-old. I had adult supervision, so don't worry about the analysis.
And tell everyone what the PDB is. This is a big deal.
Yeah. So the PDB is the President's Daily Brief. I think typically 5 or 6 days a week, the president gets a copy of the PDB. It's a book. It actually in the Bush administration. Now it's on an iPad, or at least it was under Obama. But it was like a leather-bound folder that had about 10 to 15 PDB articles in it that were written by the U.S. intelligence community, mostly then by CIA, about key topics in the world, the kind of the what, the why, and the so what of, it could be about Syria, it could be about China, it could be about, arms shipments, whatever the topic is. But it's a pretty small book. It's not hundreds of pages. It's maybe 10 to 15 articles. So to do one is kind of it's a moment that most, analysts remember the first time they got their hands on one.
And it's personally briefed every morning the President of the United States and only the very top echelons of his national security team. So it's really the culmination of someone's career to get an item in the presidential daily brief. It is the crown jewels of the intelligence community. So to be doing that as a 20-year-old is a big deal.
It was cool, and I think I was really hooked after those couple summers. The first summer was the summer of 2006. There was the 34-day war between Israel and Hezbollah. Syria is right next door. So I was kind of working on that tangentially. And then the next summer was actually the run-up to the Israeli bombing of the Syrian nuclear reactor, which was under construction out in their eastern desert at Al-Kabar. And so I was kind of involved in seeing the run-up to that. And it was just this moment where as a 20, 21-year-old, I'm like, this is really cool to kind of get a peek into the way the world really works, how governments work, how people work, and I was just hooked.
Yeah. Well, so that's a good segue. So tell us more, over the course of your time at CIA, what you did for them, what the topics you worked on, the type of work product that you're doing, and then, what surprised you most about it? So
I really worked on Syria primarily the whole time. That was my account, and I did I was Syrian politics, Syrian security. I did some counterterrorism targeting work, also on Syria inside the counterterrorism center, and it really.
And explain, by the way, counterterrorism targeting. Because this is also a big deal.
Yeah. So at the time in Syria, well, obviously this is like 2007 to 2009 period. There's an insurgency in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time people would fly into Damascus. They would kind of get smuggled into these, through these rat lines into eastern Syria and then go across the border into Iraq. And a lot of them were suicide bombers who would, blow up Iraqi security forces, checkpoints, civilians, our soldiers. And so we would try to find them before they could do that and make sure that the military had information about them. And that was really satisfying work. But most of what I did was just kind of on Syrian politics, Syrian security. And for the first 4 or 5 years I was there, that was kind of a somewhat sleepy account. It was a authoritarian country in the region that seemed pretty stable, that it was kind of a 1 PDB a year place. It was relevant because it bothered us in relationship to other regional issues, but in and of itself was never, as big of obviously a deal as Iraq or Iran or Israel, Palestine. So that all changed when the uprising began, in early 2011, and as that devolved from, sort of largely peaceful protests into insurgency, into civil war and kind of state failure and breakdown, the account became obviously much more important, and I really had a front row seat for a lot of that. I'd lived in Damascus in 2010 into 2011, right prior to that, and so I ended up really having a front row seat, kind of as the Arab awakening or winter or whatever you want to call it now.
Spring turned winter.
Yeah, exactly, as that started. So that was mostly what I what I did when I was there.
I want to come back to that because the Syrian civil war is so important in Middle Eastern history and even recent American history, and also for your own work. But before we do, tell us a little more, just kind of maybe your general reflections on your colleagues, the types of people who you're working with at CIA, what maybe surprised you about them, or either them or the nature of the work.
Yeah. I really appreciated the people at the CIA tremendously, and I still reflect very fondly on my team. I think you have a lot, and again, it's a big place, so this is a generalization, but you have a tremendous group of people. Let's talk on the analyst side, because that's the side I do the best. People who, frankly, could probably make more money if they were doing something else. But all who are sort of united in this idea of the mission of providing the best possible information to the president and to other senior policymakers, and really I think are committed to which is increasingly sort of anachronistic today, like this idea of we really want to get objective, fact-based analysis, find the truth, and communicate it. And I think at the core, a lot of the people that I worked with were really inspired by and driven by that. Was how do I find real understanding? A lot of people come out of all different backgrounds there. You have people coming out of, the team that I worked on Syria with, we had people who came from all different states, all different regions, all different backgrounds, people who had been, they were third generation agency, and other people who, they were like first generation, their parents were born elsewhere, they came here, and now they're American. So it's just really a really broad cross section of society. You had people who, like me, didn't have grad degrees. You had people who came in with PhDs. So it was really fun. I really enjoyed it a lot.
So back to the Syrian civil war, which you mentioned, you had worked on quite a bit, and you'd been working on Syria, of course, before the civil war broke out. And those of us here of a certain vintage who remember it well, or even worked on it in some ways, it was a cataclysmic event. And, of course, took place over several years. And you've got chemical weapons use, you've got massive civilian casualties, 400,000 or 500,000. You've got the emerging great power contest between the United States and Russia playing out there. You've got Iran monkeying around. But I know for students here, for today's students, you're probably in third or fourth grade when this is happening and may not have much memory of it. So tell us what it was and why it mattered and why it was so, all-consuming for you. Like what was going on there? What were the stakes? What was it about? And why should the United States government have cared?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a complicated question to answer, because one of the reasons why we never were, and I'll get into some of the reasons for the wars, one of the reasons why we never came up with a good approach to dealing with it was that we couldn't, it's a country of what at the time was 23 million people. There really isn't oil or natural gas. I mean, there's some, but it's not significant. It's not market moving because thankfully the Israelis destroyed their plutonium reactor in the Eastern Desert. There weren't nuclear weapons. There were chemical weapons, which became, a really critical piece of this. But this was a country that, from a kind of geostrategic standpoint, it was really important because of the territory that it was on. That was kind of it. We don't have any economic ties with Syria. Cultural ties, pretty limited. But it was really important because it could affect the outcome or sort of, the trajectory of the insurgency in Iraq. It could affect, at the time, or a few years prior to the civil war, we had been attempting to sort of foster this sort of nascent pro-democracy movement in Lebanon. The Syrians could create problems there. They could meddle in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, or what was left of it by that point in time. And so they kind of had this ability to put their fingers into different, put their hands into different cookie jars in the region and create problems for us. But it was always about Syria as sort of ancillary to something else. And so we really struggled, I think, as a government to come up with an approach to dealing with them in the region. And multiple administrations really struggled with how to manage that. So when the uprising began, which was, sort of cultivated for all the same or fostered for all the same reasons that you see uprisings in other Middle Eastern countries. I mean, you have, a really repressive and predatory authoritarian government. You had people who really just saw in Tunisia and Egypt that things could be different and took to the streets, and you had, a crackdown, you had some political concessions, but not enough, and you just kind of got into this spiral where, after a few months, you had an insurgency. And Washington, really struggled with the sort of how do we deal with Assad and Syrian politics side of it as the Islamic State became a bigger feature of the uprising and eventually took a lot of territory starting at around 2014, 2015. The CT side of it became much more, we actually were pretty focused on that, and the strategy
CT,
largely was counterterrorism. That was pretty effective. But on the sort of what do we do with Assad piece of it, it mattered largely because of the chemical weapons, and it mattered in the context of sort of, the broader movement for democratization in the region. But beyond that, we just, we could never, we had a tremendous gap, I think, continuously between our rhetoric and our actions, like a huge gap that just persisted and widened as the war went on and caused us to lose, I think, a lot of credibility and to, frankly, be unable to make policy decisions because we had set the bar so high with what we had said, and at the end of the day, we just weren't willing to resource it.
Yeah, and meanwhile, tremendous humanitarian costs with, like I said, the 400,000 or counting, dead Syrian civilians, and
that's right. And the dynamics of the refugee crisis, which has, I think, had ripple effects throughout Europe even.
Oh yeah. You can draw a straight line from that to Brexit, and we could. Stopping those things always came back to how do you resolve the political conflict at the heart of the Civil War, and it was unresolvable, certainly by us. So we'd never managed to find a way. Yeah, and meanwhile, the Russians and the Iranians had their own designs on it too. So,
that's right.
It was complicated. So it really was one of the thorniest foreign policy problems in the world in that entire decade, and one I know that the Obama administration wrestled with, and certainly we're not. They still look back on that as one of their biggest regrets.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Although it's easy to see what went wrong, but what could have gone right was much harder. So,
that's right. That's right. I would just draw one parallel with, you look at Ukraine and our support for the Ukrainian government. There was no, in Ukraine, there's, albeit with its warts and problems, a government that can be resourced and supported in its fight against the Russians. And in Syria, the fundamental problem was, okay, if we don't want Assad, he's creating all these other problems for us. A huge portion of his population doesn't want him either. What's the party who do we support to make that happen? And the landscape of rebel groups and insurgent groups and opposition groups was so fragmented, and the most effective ones were, frankly, Salafi jihadist groups. The idea of building an army or set of institutions that could depose him and actually govern was, almost impossible from the get-go.
Yeah. Since the Salafi jihadist groups who hated Assad also hated Americans and wanted to kill as many Americans as they could.
That's a problem.
Yeah. So, okay. So, why did you then from there? Why did you decide to eventually leave CIA, and then how did you become a spy novelist? So
it's a good question.
Our story takes an interesting plot twist.
So I had gotten to a point, I think, in my career where I looked out at a lot of the people that were ahead of me at CIA and just said, if I don't leave now, I probably won't leave. And that was mixing with, I think, some real frustration with working on Syria, with what had happened in Syria, and looking for a change. So I left. I took a job with a consulting firm, with McKinsey Company, and I had a period of about 3 to 4 months after I left the agency where we didn't have kids at that point. My wife was working and in night school, so I had a lot of free time. And I just started writing, honestly, as a way to kind of process Syria, process the war, process my CIA experience. And some of it was fiction, some of it was not, and I never intended for it to be published. I just kind of wrote it for me. But I found in that, and I wrote, over 100,000 words or something like that summer.
That's a lot. That's a book.
It's about the length of a book, although this was a really bad book.
Okay.
So this would have been unsaleable commercially, and I had never intended for it to go anywhere.
Yeah.
But I had so loved the process of writing, of just sitting down and actually writing, that I wanted to find some way to get back to doing that. So, you fast forward about 5 years, and I was ready for a change in the consulting job, and eventually, instead of leaving, I basically took a 6-month leave of absence and wrote. Went back to it, kind of dusted off the old manuscript, and realized just how terrible it was. But there was a kernel there of something. There were a few characters in that I thought I could work with, and so I think with some objectivity, some distance from CIA, from Syria, and just 5 years having gone by, I kind of sat down and said, all right, I'll try to write something that I want on my nightstand and that other people might want to read. And Damascus Station came out of that effort.
So, and we're going to be talking about Moscow X in a second, but we do have copies of Damascus Station for sale in paperback outside, and we'll also sign those, so which is truly excellent. So, yeah, but I know you'd started to touch on this, how Damascus Station evolves out of some of that initial just kind of pouring out words to reflect on your own time in Syria. But how does that go from just kind of this process of almost kind of being a diarist, if you will, just putting it down to thinking, wait a minute, I'm now going to turn this into a piece of fiction based in real life that people might want to actually buy and read? Like, how do you develop the characters and the plot and the kind of a whole story out of this beyond,
Yeah. Well, it was a real mess.
Okay.
It was like 2 steps forward, maybe 3 steps back sometimes process, because I'd never written creatively. I don't have an MFA. I'd never taken a creative writing course in my life, and I'd been writing for the CIA at McKinsey, where I was writing, but it's a very anodyne, bureaucratic, kind of dry writing by design. And so my approach, which has not been, it's not efficient, but it seems to work, I guess, or it's worked for me so far, is I basically, I don't outline, and I try to find characters as I write who have energy and life to them and who want things. And I try to find characters who want the opposite things from the other characters and sort of put them together and see what happens. And I kind of know generally from a genre standpoint, I'm writing spy fiction, so it's helpful if they're intelligence officers or assets or working in intelligence agencies. And the stakes, you try to have the stakes be as high as possible, but not something I try to be careful of is for the stakes of the story to never just be some obscure geopolitical thing, but for it to be really intimately wound up with the characters. So the stakes are really, everything's about the characters. And I write a lot. I find that I usually have to write somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 words to get a 120,000 word book out. So it's a lot of stuff that gets thrown away. But I just kind of dig it up. It's a little bit, I guess an analogy I would use is it's a little bit like an archaeological dig where, the book's down there somewhere and you have to unearth a lot of stuff. Sometimes it doesn't seem productive and you're like digging over here and then you realize you have to be over here. But I find that I don't know of a better way yet, and I do feel like all of that digging can sometimes feel like it's for nothing, but in actuality, it's the way you get to the story. So even if I write 20, 30 pages of stuff that I know is even as I'm writing it, is kind of not going to go anywhere, I don't know a better way to kind of get to the stuff that will eventually be the book than having gone through all the crap.
Yeah. Well, and following up on that, so tell us about how you develop your characters. I mean, you've got some very vivid, evocative, memorable characters, and I'll ask you about a couple in the new novel in a moment. But are they like based on real people you've known?
So it's been a mix. I think a couple of them have started as composites of people that I've known at the CIA. But then they quickly kind of take on a life of their own and become wholly distinct. A couple of them, I would say, have actually, it's kind of weird to say this, but they just kind of appear. Like they just show up a little bit like I'm writing and somebody has walked into the room. And you're like, okay, I'm going to write this person's voice and how they dress and how they carry themselves and how they think. So it's a mix of those two things. I mean, sometimes if I'm feeling stuck, it's helpful to start with, okay, this is a person I'm thinking of. They're a case officer. They look this way. They kind of move. So you just start with something that's real, and then it can become a character that's separate from them. But yeah, sometimes it's just they just appear.
Okay, so should we worry at all if in one of your future novels a center director from the University of Florida shows up and is that Matt Jacobs?
I am selling character rights to future books.
Okay,
so if you want in, there's a way.
Okay. So tell us then, let's shift now to your latest release, this fantastic new one, again, Moscow X. How did you develop the idea for Moscow X, especially because your first novel, Damascus Station, you said is very much based on your experiences there in Syria, but you hadn't worked in or around Russia much in your intelligence course. This was somewhat new territory for you, right?
Yeah, it was very new. And actually, being in Russia was maybe a tremendous mistake because I had to do a whole lot of extra work that it took me a long time. The way it started, actually, though, was I had this idea that I would set a spy novel entirely in Texas, where I live. And I had, because in part, at the time, we had just had our third child. So we had a baby. And it was sort of COVID times, and so I'm like, the travel could be hard to do research. So like, I'll just set one in Texas, and that'll be kind of cool to have a spy novel in Texas. So I had like Russian defectors running around Dallas, and I had a Russian assassination team that was using like a Turbinex van as cover, driving around the suburbs, and I had to chase from Dallas down into the Big Bend area. And I wrote probably about 100 pages of that story, and even at the time, sort of knew in kind of my more honest moments that it maybe wasn't going to work.
Okay.
But I sent it to my editor, and who had talked with me about the concept, and I would say was like supportive, but not as much as I may have wanted. And he read it. He's a very blunt, very old man, and he called me and he said, "This isn't good. And I don't think you should write this book." And I kind of knew he was right, although it was very painful. So I threw it all away. I literally just took the files and took them off, like sent them to, I think my wife, so she had them, and I deleted them from my computer because I didn't want to go back. And I was like, oh crap, this is bad, because I spent about 3 months doing that. But I had a couple Russian characters who had been in Dallas in the draft. And I as you can imagine, as a writer, so it was kind of a dark period to throw all that stuff out. So I was not happy. I was on a walk around a lake in our neighborhood, and was trying to like think through plot stuff, but eventually just kind of like gave up and was getting like around a loop on this walk, and then I had something like an image came into my head, to be honest, and it was of a woman on horseback riding away from a burning house. I didn't know who it was, and I didn't know like why she was on the horse. But I was like, that's the story. I need to find that. And so I started to write. I took the characters and
read the book. You'll see. This is okay. Wow.
Yeah, but it was one of those moments where I'm like, I'm gonna try to find that. And so I took some of the characters from the other stuff, none of the actual prose, but just the kind of the concept of the character, and put them in Russia. And then brought in one of my characters from Damascus Station, Artemis Proctor, who's the chief of Moscow X in this book, and started to I had my kind of two sides then, and then it went.
Okay.
But it was a very unpleasant process
to
get there. And then as soon as I moved the characters to Russia, then I realized how much research I was going to have to do. And that was also somewhat unpleasant.
I wanted to go there next, and we'll come back to a couple of other things in the book. And don't worry, I'm not going to give away the end, right? So no spoiler alerts here. But there's while keeping the story moving along very well, there's a lot of tradecraft in this book, and there's a very obviously unique tradecraft that the American intelligence community has need to employ in a denied or restricted area like Russia. There's obviously a deep history of this, and even though you had your own experience with CIA, you hadn't worked the Russia account much before. So tell us, how did you go about just kind of learning the requisite tradecraft to make this as authentic as possible? There's some really interesting cyber elements in here as well. So again, tell us about that part of the research.
Yeah. So I generally I've tried in the books in Damascus Station to be as true as possible, as as is responsibly possible, I guess, to the agency's tradecraft. And in this one, you think about like Syria. The first novel was Syria of like 10 years ago. So the characters are using, the CIA officers are working out of an embassy. It's tradecraft as we might have seen it in like the Cold War.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to operate, if you're operating in Russia, let's say, really all that old style, you can't do it anymore. I mean, it's not that it's all gone. It's just that the sort of ubiquitous technical surveillance that we all now live under, whether we know it or not, makes so much of that old stuff.
Are you listening, Putin?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So much of that old stuff completely obsolete. Like there's been a real fundamental revolution, I think, in the way that we have to spot, assess, develop and recruit and handle human assets. And I wanted characters in my book that could actually spend time with one another, not interact impersonally through dead drops, digital or otherwise, or in very, very quick kinds of meetings that would have to happen if a CIA officer is interacting with a Russian in Russia. And so the agency officers in this book, at least a couple of them, some of the main characters are under non-official cover. So they have a more elaborate commercial form of cover. Neither of them are American citizens. And so they're able to operate
one's South
in Russia.
African, one's
One's
Mexican.
South African and one's Mexican.
Yeah.
And I think sort of increasingly that's the kind of way of the future or just the now in human operations, human intelligence operations. And so I wanted that for both purposes of plot and character, so they could actually spend time in Russia with Russians. But I also thought it was a kind of an interesting lens on intelligence operations that is out there in other spy fiction, but I wanted to play around with. So that's kind of where it came from, and the process of kind of getting the tradecraft right is I spend a lot of time talking with formers, including in this one some former.
Explain what formers.
Oh, yeah, former CIA officers, so people who have, left the agency, or former case officers, or I spoke. We call these officers under non-official cover NOCs. I spent time with a couple former NOCs to kind of get some of the details of the tradecraft right, and the mindset and all of that kind of stuff. So I really try to ground it as much as possible in just the meet with these people and they tell me their stories and they tell me, I kind of give them a hypothetical, which is kind of close to the plot of the book, and we're off to the races typically. So I've found that grounding it in reality, I don't know, it's fun for me because I like to learn about this stuff, and then I also think it's fun for the narrative to sprinkle that stuff throughout.
Yeah. Well, and there's certainly some indications that current CIA officers and professionals are fans of yours, and I understand you gave a talk on this recently at CIA headquarters, and Director Burns brought you in and wanted to talk about it too. So
yeah, that was cool.
When the CIA director is reading your books and thinks they're good, then you're doing something right. So
yeah, that was cool, and it's been I think the reaction from formers has been, pretty positive, just because there's so much in the genre that's not super authentic to the CIA, to say the least. And so the fact that I'm at least trying, I think more people in the community are maybe willing to give it a chance.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So, and then how about, another fun part of the book, and again, I'm not giving too much away here, is it's kind of head snapping how you're popping all over the world. Good parts of it take place in Russia, some in London, some on this really interesting horse farm in Mexico, some in Silicon Valley. Did you travel to those places? Like, how did you research those and bring the authenticity of those out?
You know what? I didn't do much travel for this one.
Okay.
I didn't go to Monterey. But I didn't go to research the book. And I've been to Palo Alto a bunch, but not for the book. So I could kind of draw on memory.
Yeah.
Russia, I couldn't. I've never visited, and I did not visit to research the novel. I spent a lot of time talking to Russians, who most of whom are in the States now, who grew up in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I had an FSB defector helped as kind of a consultant on the project.
FSB.
The Russian Federal Security Service. So it's essentially a pretty juiced up version of the Russian FBI. One of their main intelligence services. He had defected, maybe 5 or 10 years ago or something like that, and is living in D.C. And I got in touch with him through some CIA folks who were, and he was happy to help on the project. So, I really, the Russia stuff kind of drove me nuts though, because I couldn't go. I didn't have, a great, obviously, mental picture of it. So I just had tons of conversations with Russians about, okay, in St. Petersburg, what's the traffic like? What are the desirable neighborhoods? What do people wear? What do people eat? What does it smell like? All that kind of stuff. How do you etiquette? How do people walk? All this detailed stuff that you won't really find in, foreign policy or history books about Russia.
Yeah. And again, not giving anything away, but the book isn't a very flattering portrayal of the Putin regime. So I'm guessing that Moscow's not on your book tour, right?
I don't think so. Okay. We have yet to sell the Russian rights to the novel. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah. And then one more question on this book. How did you conceive and develop the main characters, especially Sia Fox and Max Castillo and then Anna Andropova?
Agapova.
Yeah. That's right. So.
They honestly were characters that kind of walked into the room.
Kind of like the lady on horseback. It just kind of happens.
A little bit. Yeah. They came out of this process. None of those characters were in the version that I threw away. Oh, I'm sorry. Anna was one of the Russian defectors in Dallas, and I moved her to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Okay. And Sia and Max were characters that just kind of, as I wrote, they started to appear on the page. And they a lot of the characters will start with maybe different descriptions of what they look like, or even different last names, or different names. And then they kind of transform over the course of writing. And I'll typically will see, with Max, I still remember the day when I started writing a scene with him. He was at headquarters. He wasn't Mexican at that point, which is just kind of a weird how these things get created. And then all of a sudden, as I'm working on the character, I'm sort of realizing that he needs to be down in Monterey, and he kind of walks this way, talks this way, moves this way. And as I write, I discover that character. So that's what happened with both him and Sia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, all right, just a couple more questions for me before we're going to turn it over to the audience. First, can you give us any sneak previews of your next book? I know this one's just out, but you're very, very productive, and I understand there's another book that's going to be coming out too.
Yeah. So the third one's done, written, sold. It'll be out next fall. It's called this. The working title is The Seventh Floor. That could change, so don't hold me to that.
And that's where the leadership is at CIA. So the seventh floor is kind of the shorthand for, it's kind of like what we say around here. Tiger says this, Tiger says that. The seventh floor says this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And it's a mole hunt, so it's kind of a modern homage to the great spy novel Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré. It's about a Russian mole inside Langley, and one of the characters actually from Moscow X, named Artemis Proctor, is in the kind of George Smiley role. So she's the mole hunter who's trying to find this Russian penetration of the agency. So it's got a bit of, it's a spy novel, but there's a bit of a kind of whodunit mystery aspect to it. So we kind of meet the suspect list early on and then try to figure out through Artemis Proctor's investigation who the mole is. So I'm really excited about it, and it's done. It'll be out next year.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, all right. And final question for me is, if we have any aspiring intelligence officers in the room or aspiring novelists, any advice, right? So, for people, since you've done both, of either career path. So, if I were a UF undergraduate thinking about wanting to do one or both of these things, any advice since you've walked this path?
Yeah. Well, I'd say on the intelligence officer point, that's something I said in a talk earlier today with some of the students, that I think really immersing yourself in, especially I'll speak to being an analyst, right? Because that's what I know the best. Actually immersing yourself in another part of the world, study abroad, learning the language, actually getting deep on the politics and the history and the culture, trying to develop, if you're interested in that in a part of the world, to really start to build that expertise now. I think that being really curious about the world is a great sign that being a CI analyst will probably be a good fit. So I would really encourage, if you're interested in the intelligence community, to kind of think about that. And then on writing, I mean, this is going to sound kind of dumb, but I really do think that a huge piece of this is actually just sitting down every day to write, or like 6 days a week. And it could be 20 minutes. It doesn't have to be long. But I talk with so many people who have ideas for books or want to write, but actually just never put pen to paper, or they wait until they're inspired and they work for a couple weeks and then that wears off and they stop and the story goes nowhere. And so I think, if you want to write, I mean, there's really nothing. The barriers to entry are so low. You need a piece of paper and a pen or a laptop or a typewriter. Like, that's it. So I just start writing, and hold yourself to a word count. It could be 100 words a day, but really just do it. I mean, nothing significant in life happens without a whole bunch of very small sort of steps. And then if you write a couple hundred words a day and you do that 350 days a year, at the end of the year, you're going to have something there. So I really just encourage people to write. And I think the second thing on writing is you just have to read a lot too. Those are the two components. If you read a lot in and outside of the genre or the type of book that you might want to write, and you write every day, you will get better at writing.
Yeah. Okay, I said that was the last one, but since I do have to do one follow-up, just because you mentioned reading a lot as well. Other than David McCloskey, who would be some of your other favorite spy novelists, or any that you would recommend?
Well, let's see. We talked about him, John le Carré. I think you can't go wrong there with any of his books, really. Charles McCary, who I know we're both fans
love
of.
Charles McCary.
Who is I think, unfortunately, not super well-known American spy novelist.
Yeah, a lot of his books are out of print, but you can,
a lot of them are out of
get
print.
them in back order.
His books are wonderful. He wrote a great one called Tears of Autumn, which kind of made a name for him. Now pretty old, but still very wonderful.
He's also a former CIA.
Former CIA, yeah. He was CIA. I mean, it might have been back in the 60s or something like that. It's a long time ago. David Ignatius. Daniel Silva's books I think are really fun. He writes about an Israeli Mossad officer who's also an art restorer, which is really, really quite fun. Joe Cannon has written a number of historical spy novels that I think are amazing. A guy named Charles Cumming, who's a Brit, has got 10 or 15 really great spy novels. Boy, who else?
Who did the Red Sparrow trilogy?
Oh, Jason Matthews. Yeah.
Also former
that's great.
CIA.
Also former CIA. That trilogy is great. He unfortunately passed away a couple years ago, but those books are really wonderful, especially the first one. A guy named Paul Vidic has written a whole bunch of historical spy novels that I think are really atmospheric and great. There's a new one out by a woman named I.S. Berry called The Peacock and the Sparrow. She's also a former agency officer. That one I think came out maybe 5 or 6 months ago, that I think is really great. She's very talented. There's a lot out there. I think the spy genre is alive and well, for sure.
Yeah, they just don't. There's so many more of those than there are professor novels, right? Anyway, so it works. So that's grammar. But all right, okay. Questions from the audience. So.
How would you say working at the CIA affected you ethically, and how your moral compass might evolve when you look at these geopolitical topics or human lives?
Good question. Wow.
I think it really, and especially working on the Syrian civil war and watching that, it was, I think, really a kind of eye-opening experience on human nature, to be honest with you, and how, frankly, brutal and inhuman it can be in situations where, Syria was a country, it was a very flawed authoritarian state, but you had a lot of these communities lived, intermarried, were close to one another, had lived together for a long period of time, and as soon as this sort of, the security system in the country fell apart, they started, there was ethnic cleansing, there was brutal conflict between some of these ethnic and sectarian groups, and it was a really, really kind of eye-opening experience for me to watch that happen and to see what's possible in a situation like that. And then I think on the flip side, to watch, so you had that inhumanity, but then you have all these actually listening to the way refugees would talk about it, or even just kind of getting to know Syrians, like tremendous examples of heroism and bravery and self-sacrifice. And I think watching that kind of, I don't know, just that like that dichotomy, that paradox sort of human nature that, we're capable of all of the above, was probably something that I sort of intellectually understood maybe prior to watching that, but after having lived through it, it just was very, very apparent, and really, really, really striking. And it's something I still carry, through to this day. I think, I don't know if the question was also about sort of the, morality or the ethics of spycraft, but I don't know, I kind of came away from my CIA experience with the belief that I want us to have an information advantage over, our adversaries, and the CIA and spying, is kind of weird as some of the, day-to-day can be, is really an important tool in the United States, having, the best possible information to then give to the people who are making our decisions so that they can make the best possible decisions. Yeah, I don't know. I hope that answers the question.
But let me follow up on that a little bit, because it's a very good question. The last part, your defense there of spycraft, the intelligence tradecraft, because at the end of the day, what CIA exists to do is lie for the United States, steal for the United States, steal from others, and encourage others to betray their own countries. Like, how can you do that and call yourself a moral person?
Well, I said no hard questions.
All right, okay. That's not my question. That's what James wanted me to ask. Okay, yeah.
I think, I think it's a hard. There's a reason why people wrestle with this, right?
Yeah.
And there's a reason why case officers, who are primarily the ones who are doing that kind of recruitment, of human assets, and really it's in there, as an analyst, you can be a little bit arm's length from that stuff.
But you're benefiting from
benefiting from it, right? Yeah. I think that ultimately, I don't know if it's a means justifying the ends kind of a thing here, but I just come at it and say, I want us to have the information that we need to protect our republic, to protect our way of life, and to give the people making the decisions the best possible stuff. And that in its service, I'm willing to countenance the theft of information from others who might do us harm, or frankly from those who we're in competition with. And I think maybe on the other side of eternity, those kind of trade-offs won't be necessary, but I think they are here. And if we don't have it, somebody else is going to. And so that's kind of where I come down on it.
Thanks. All right. Other questions?
I agree, it's absolutely necessary. But I find another problem, which is, I think, even bigger. Like in Venezuela, there was a spy, I am from Venezuela, that was friends with my friend. And
he was an active part of the political opposition in Venezuela. It's a very
I know a Chavista agent. Don't worry. or the opposite. But well, so my friend asked him, how do you do your work? Like, for example, a minister hired him. And he said, what do you do for the minister? Well, the first thing I intervene in the minister's phone, because I want to make sure he's not using me for something strange. So what I find hardest is that in this network of DC, how do you know that you are not being played in an unjust movement? You know what I mean? It's something,
Well, that was hard. Give you the Syrian context, which I know, which I think relates to your point, which is it was almost impossible to tell amongst, like, as we were trying to find groups in the anti-Assad opposition that we might be able to work with. It was very hard to sort through who was the real deal and who wasn't, and who was trying to, steal money from us or take weapons and disappear, and sort of sorting through all of that was tremendously difficult and messy, and it was very unclear at any given decision point if we were making the right decision. That kind of ambiguity, I think, characterizes a tremendous amount of the work, and means that oftentimes, you get stuff wrong. Oftentimes you get the analytic call wrong because you're sorting through, contradictory information and all these competing different kind of interests. And frankly, the case officers who are out there trying to recruit people, that process they don't bat 500. That process oftentimes doesn't work. It fails or sputters out, or they get screamed at by the person they were trying to recruit when they make the pitch. So I think there's a tremendous amount of grayness and ambiguity in the world of espionage, which is why I think it makes for good fiction in a lot of respects, because you have this sort of full gamut of human nature to deal with in an environment where it's just absolutely not clear what the right decision is. Even your question about, you got to lie and steal and cheat to get this information, but we really need it. Right there you've got the tension for a good story. So.
All right. Other questions? Back over here, yes.
In a world of AI and remakes, how do you come up with such original ideas for your plots?
In other words, did ChatGPT write this novel? Okay, it's right. All right.
I have played around with ChatGPT a little bit, not for the book, don't worry, but just to see kind of what it was capable of writing, and I had it write a chapter of a spy novel, not one that I have used or will use, and it was like okay. I mean, it was kind of dumb, and there were a bunch of errors in it, but it's pretty effective. My view on this is, I think, kind of unformed at this point, just because I don't know. It's such a profound, it seems like we're on the cusp of, or watching a very profound change in the nature of work in many respects. And I'm kind of a purist, I think, here, and I'm worried that the work, there's different kinds of writing, right? And a lot of different kinds of writing will no doubt be disrupted by AI. But I'm worried that there will be a whole run of stories that come out that have been mass-produced by AI, and that there will be massive kind of verification challenges associated with labeling them appropriately versus stories that are created just, by humans. And I'm probably biased here, but I think that stories that are created by humans should have more weight and should be more valued by our society. And, I think the verification problem is going to be very significant. And there will probably be a whole bunch of spy novels that are sort of any novel, right, be disrupted by stories that are, sort of pushed out by AI factories. And many people might not care, readers may not care. But I hope they do. And I hope that, Amazon and other distribution platforms get pretty serious about making sure that they're very clear if you're paying for a book that was written by an algorithm or by a human. So, I don't know. We'll see.
All right. Carl, a fellow Wheaton.
Okay, there you go.
So I was just curious, when you talk about what people in the intelligence field get out of reading science. So I imagine for us, it's there's a mystique to it, there's sort of secret knowledge you feel you're gaining, whether it's true or not. Do you have that sense? For people that are immersed in it, what do you take away from reading science?
For a while when I was inside, I didn't read them. Because after about 2 days at Langley, I was like, this isn't anything like the stories, and and a lot of people inside don't actually read spy fiction and won't touch it. They don't watch they don't watch the shows, So I think there is a significant segment of the population that just stays away. For those who do, I think it's probably the same reasons that the rest of us read it. If it's done well, it can be very entertaining because you have, high concept, high stakes plots, and you have, again, you can have a love story in there. You can have stories about friendship, all these, stories about betrayal, and all these, great things that make great fiction. So I think it's probably for similar reasons that the rest of us do. But I know a lot of people who don't read it inside. I also think there's probably a smaller subset who are reading it because they're curious to see what the writer gets wrong, or misses about intelligence work. But among those kind of fans of it on the inside, I imagine there's also just some who grew up on this stuff. It might have been part of the reason why they joined, to begin with. And they've been fans of the genre, an ongoing conversation in the genre for years, and are sort of following it forward. So a lot of different reasons. But yeah, when I was there, I didn't read much spy fiction. Yeah.
What do you hope people? So it's a version of Carl's question, but a different side of it. So what do you hope people glean from reading your novels? Now I know there's the psychological portrait about the ambiguity and characters, and so it's that novel side of it. But the sort of spy side, is there something, I don't mean they're didactic in any way, but is there something you hope, again, an uninitiated general reader will learn, other than just spy craft, maybe something about politics, or is that kind of part of the project?
Yeah. Well, I will say, when I'm writing them, it never starts with that being important. Like I don't start with that in mind and figure out how I'm going to make that clear in the story. I think looking back, or as I'm going through the revisions and editing process, sometimes those themes become more clear, and then I try to accentuate them. But none of the books have started as a project to teach anything, for sure. That said, I think thematically across the novels, now the third one being done too, on the CIA side, I think I feel like when you look at a lot of spy fiction, you get a very incorrect portrayal of the actual just institution of the CIA and the people who work there. And so I think I'm hopeful in some small way that through the characters, through the plots, we get down to something approaching the sort of like culture or ethos of the place, and that would come through the experiences of the characters. I am trying also just to show the world of CIA case officers, which I think in most spy fiction are kind of treated as like, superhero spies. They're usually, called incorrectly CIA agents, which drives me bananas. And
The FBI has agents.
Yeah, FBI has agents. CIA, has officers.
If you're a CIA agent, you're the other
you're
side.
the foreigner working. Yeah. And so I think there's a little bit of like wanting to bring that world to life. That's part of it. I think on the geopolitical side, or the setting, certainly in Damascus Station, it felt important to me to punch holes into different sides of the Syrian civil war, so that the reader would walk away having some appreciation of, I think, the humanity that was so, just kind of wrecked by that conflict, or scarred by that conflict, that I didn't want it to be a cartoon, where Syrians were bad guys, or they were just kind of flat characters that were uninteresting. Like I wanted that conflict to kind of come to life on the page, because I have this feeling now, 10 years on, that the way we interpret that war has kind of risen up to this level of, there's different political narratives about it, many of which the Russians are trying to promote. So it's Assad versus the terrorists, and you kind of get up to this level pretty quickly where the human experience of it, the individual contribution, and frankly, the start of the conflict was really about this, really a cry for dignity on the part of a lot of ordinary Syrians, that was just it's been totally erased and lost. And so I'm hopeful that, in Damascus Station, some of that is reclaimed is too strong, but that you get some hint of that through the stories of the characters. And I think on this one, on Moscow X, I did want to deal as realistically as I could with Putin's Russia and his regime and how it works. And I think a lot of the way that people inside that system try to get dignity for themselves and some measure of sort of freedom and agency. And so I think across the novels, there's maybe been a bit of a consistent theme of, in an authoritarian system that's pretty different from our own, how do ordinary people deal with those different constraints and, try to get kind of the things that we all want, some measure of dignity and freedom. So that's what I'd say.
James.
What makes a character nice?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways that a character can be interesting. I think they can want sort of extreme things, or they can want to get something that's really hard. They can be a risk taker who is willing to put a lot on the, put something on the line that's significant to get something even bigger. I think they can also be despicable, and have a fundamental view of the world or just of morality that's completely alien to our own. So there's a character in Moscow X who's a fairly deranged FSB officer, Russian intelligence officer, who has a view of the world and of sort of morality and Russia's view in the world that's kind of completely alien to most of us. I think he's interesting because he thinks about things so much differently than certainly I do as the author. I think that what makes characters uninteresting is that they don't want things, or they're not on any kind of quest or journey, or like they're not trying to get something. And if you have a character who's just kind of there in stasis, they just won't be interesting. You could sustain a couple chapters off of that, but then you run out. But I think that fundamental desire to get something is what makes characters interesting. Now it has to go kind of beyond that. It can go beyond that to language or the way they dress or the way they carry themselves. But fundamentally, it's got to start with that. They want to get something.
Right. Yes.
As an analyst, how do you get better at your job, and how much history of past CT operations did you find yourself reflecting back on to try to tackle something new, or put on new lenses to look at new that or something? How would you
well, I think you're always trying to. You look at a place like Syria. There's always something else that you could be reading about it. Some new book, article, some new angle on the history. I think that the way we got better was by spending time there, reading as much as you could, talking to people. And frankly, one of the ways you get better as an analyst, I think, is, and there's different paths, but actually by moving around a little bit to see different problems. And frankly, sometimes to work on things, you might work on something from a regional standpoint, and then you might go and work on something from a more functional standpoint. So you're kind of constantly honing, I think, your ability to look at problems in new ways, right? And that kind of cycling, I think, we had people on my team who, would work on Syria. They might go do something else for 2, 3, 4 years. They might come back, and they're better analysts for that. I think oftentimes you'd also go do a policy rotation down. You could do that at the National Security Council, and that provides you're sort of thinking about the same problems, but you're looking at it from the lens of, well, I'm making policy, recommending policy, not just doing the intelligence work of describing what's going on in a country and why and what it means for the U.S. You're actually having to make decisions on the policy, which then you come back to the intelligence world after that, and you have a different, I think a different perspective on the intelligence work. So it's a little bit of all of that. The CIA also invests pretty heavily in training and development. And so there'd be a lot of times where you'd go away from your job for a week or two or even just a couple of days to kind of get real in-depth training on critical thinking, writing, or I remember a class we took on like foreign perceptions of the U.S. where they had brought people in from academics in, and they would talk about here's Iranian views of the U.S. and Chinese views of the U.S. and Syrian views of the U.S. And so there's an infinite number of ways that you can get sharper as an analyst. Those are just some of them.
Yes.
What are the advantages of telling this kind of drama from a written medium as opposed to video in terms of style or
Well, I think one of them is I can do it. I don't need other people to do it. If I film and TV or theater, the person writing is kind of one piece of it, a really important piece. But then you've got people who are doing the costumes and the production, and film and TV. It's even much more expansive than that. So you're playing a sort of smaller role, I think, in the overall storytelling as the writer in those other mediums. In a novel, it's just you're playing all those roles as the writer, which can be at its best, it can be really thrilling because you can have total control over the world that you're sort of unearthing. If you want to put someone in a red coat, you put them in a red coat, and you can put them in a blue coat, and you can make them go do this thing. I think the author is more godlike in a novel than the writer would be in a TV show or in theater. Yeah.
Does the CIA have to review your manuscripts? And if so, how arduous is that process? And is it ever going to stop?
No.
After your fifth book, and then all right, we trust you?
No, it's never going to stop. Yeah, they do have to review them. The CIA has a publication review board that has to go through the novels. They have been pretty efficient with mine. Maybe I like to think that they're just really loving the story, so they get them done pretty quickly. But I think within a couple weeks, they've given me the books back, and the edits have so far been relatively fair, I would say. And I've appealed a couple of them, and they've relented, and on a couple instances, I've said, okay, yeah, that makes sense to take out. Fiction has a different bar than nonfiction. So if I were writing a memoir of my time as a CIA analyst working on Syria, that would have been harder to get through. Whereas, a novel you can, weirdly, it's just kind of insane. I could say something in the novel that's true, and then I could have a colleague who's writing an article for, The Atlantic or whatever, and if they said the same true thing, it would probably get edited out. So it's a bit of a wonky process, but I have so far found it to be, fair for me and pretty speedy. So no complaints yet.
John.
This is about the art of writing. I thought you did this incredible job in Damascus Station. You had two characters in a martial arts engagement, and you used it to go really in depth in their personalities, right? You used it as a tool to reveal a lot about them. But what was really amazing to me is the level of detail you went into on this martial arts. Did you study martial arts? Did you visualize it? How did you write? I mean, it's really detailed. It's really great. How did you do it?
I read a book about Krav Maga, and I read a lot of articles, and I watched a lot of YouTube videos of people practicing, but of actual legitimate practice of it. That was what I did, because I didn't, a lot of things like the horse racing stuff in Moscow X, I had no background in it whatsoever, but I just kind of was interested in it, and so I spent a lot of time kind of going deep on it. But yeah, I had no personal experience with it. Yeah. It's kind of amazing how much you can do if you invest just even the slightest bit of kind of research time in trying to appreciate something and think about how your character might interact with it. I had a friend of mine who writes thrillers, and he set his entire book in this kind of remote part of Alaska. And I had read the book before I met him, And after he'd had like 2 beers at the bar one time at a writers' conference, he's never been to Alaska. And I honestly think like it's actually one of the things that I really love about writing is it gives you this ability, no matter who you are, where you are, what your background is, to get in the skin of somebody else, to learn something about some other part of the world that you might never experience or never have the chance to visit or practice or whatever, and really empathize with it, learn a ton about it. I think it's a really cool aspect of fiction that I think, if you read a lot of fiction and you practice it a lot, like it can really give you an appreciation, I think, for other people, other ways of thinking and seeing the world. So, but yes, I faked my way through that one.
All right. So, okay, Carlos. Good.
One thing, how can you identify yourself with your character? Because I write like the author and the character is different, but how do you do that? What are there tricks to get into the skin of your character? Yeah.
I just see it as, honestly, when I'm writing, I see it as I'm telling somebody else's story. So it's like I'm not the character. I never think of myself as the character. I never really put myself in a character's shoes. I'm just trying to hear what the character is saying. And so then there are parts of the book where I'll zoom out, and I'm not being explicit about it, that this is the narrator talking, but there are parts where I zoom out of both books, and it's clear it's kind of the author's voice. So I do that a little bit, but I'm conscious when that's happening that's actually my voice. It's not one of the characters. The characters, it's just kind of, what are they? I honestly see it as I'm not trying to get in the head of this person. I'm just listening to them talk. That's how I separate it out.
James?
Yeah, just to, the martial arts question came up and the Moscow thing as well. So do you think your time at working in consultancy helped you to gain kind of an instinct for getting into something you're not familiar with and kind of mastering it before you're writing, or do you think that's more part of your personality or both?
Well, I think it's certainly true that oftentimes we get, probably even more so than at CIA, at McKinsey, you'd be tossed into something where you were sort of expected to get really smart on it really quickly, and you often had to fake your way there to start, That's probably helpful as a writer. Maybe also in part to be stupid enough to jump into those situations, or have enough of a risk tolerance to say, I'm going to try this and see if it works. And not get too hung up on the fact that when you're starting to write it or approaching it, you don't know anything about that topic. I think for me, honestly, I just really like learning about new things. It really is a motivating factor for me, and so I feel like maybe just predisposed to, okay, like Russia, the characters should probably be in Russia. I can start. I kind of know how to start chipping away at the problem. Figure out some agency colleagues who know Russia, read 30 books on it, go find some Russians. So I can kind of start to walk myself into it. And fortunately, as the stories, as the drafts go on, the questions that you need to answer do become more specific. And so you can, you can get kind of clear with people about what you need. I can talk to I've got a scene in Moscow X in a St. Petersburg restaurant, so I can have a conversation with 2 people from St. Petersburg about their favorite restaurants and what it's like in one, and okay, that's something I can hear their story, I can put that down on paper. But yeah, I think probably the consulting work helped me to take that plunge a little bit more. But I've always liked learning about new things.
Yeah. All right. Well, we do need to allow some time for the book table and book signing. I do want to especially thank our co-sponsors today, Professor Matt Jacobs and the Bob Graham Center, and then Professor Damon Woodard and the Florida Institute for National Security, both in different ways doing really important work here on campus in this broader national security realm. And my final reflection is there's really just 2 kinds of people in the world. There's those who have read Moscow X and those who should read Moscow X.
That's good, yeah.
So you are one of those 2. Make sure that you don't leave here without becoming the first one. So anyway, please join me in thanking David McCloskey.
Thanks, Will. Thank
That was
you.
awesome, man. Really good. So.